queer and straight, and would also consider myself like an earth activist.
Thank you for that, James. Anyone else?
My name is Fred Malo, and I'm from Carbondale. And am I still on here? Yeah. And I identify myself as a letter to the editor writer.
Thank you for that, Fred. I'm trying to get to the chat right now because everything just got moved around. So give me 1 second. I know there's folks that are sharing. Oh, thank you, Deb. You said you are a white woman who's also a concerned environmentalist. And so the reason why we're starting with this icebreaker is in our last training, we really dove into and discussed our positionality and how where we are positioned in the world impacts our ability to do this work. And especially when it comes to climate work or environmental justice, a lot of it involves us working across race and class because the community is mostly impacted. So we first have to acknowledge our positionality and what we identify as. Alrighty, so once again, I'm Stephanie Bowman. I'm with Mothers Out Front. We are a nonprofit organization that works on mobilizing mothers around climate justice issues. And I am Pueblo and Colorado Springs climate justice organizer, as well as our national movement and campaigns organizer. And I'll pass it to Amy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Amy, and I'm the volunteer and Jedi director at 350 Colorado and a mobilization organizer at Stop the Money Pipeline. And it's nice to have everybody back for round 2.
So the objectives of today's training is to understand that communities of color do not live one issue lives, and that environmental justice intersects with different segments of society. Like today we are going to cover youth, pipelines, LGBTQIA, criminal justice, immigration, disability, and the elderly. We will provide practical steps to show up in an intersectional way, and we will identify how intersectionality shows up in our everyday lives. All right, I always like to be very clear about what we're going to cover. So we're doing our welcome and objectives now. We just did our introductions. We're going to dive into some meeting norms. We're going to dive into what intersectionality is and what environmental justice is. And then we will have different speakers and information shared about the youth and its intersection with environmental justice, pipelines, LGBTQIA, criminal justice, immigration, disability, and elderly, as well as make sure that you leave with solutions and some practical steps. So our meeting norms, if you're able to have your camera on, it's just very helpful, especially when you're sharing, for us to just get to know each other. But if you don't feel comfortable, I understand, you can keep your camera off. We want folks to be vulnerable, to participate, to ask questions, and wait for it. Some questions we may not be able to answer today, but we can incorporate in a training in the future. Everyone has the right to comfort. We want to remember that it is impact over intent, self-transformation, and that we also just want to be aware of our language. Okay, so intersectionality. Intersectionality, this is just a brief overview of what we went over last time in our part 1. But for folks who may have missed it or weren't able to join, we first have to define what intersectionality is. So intersectionality to describe the idea that women experience layers of oppression, and it can be caused by gender, by race, by class, and it had been introduced by civil rights Dr. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in around 1989. And so it pretty much is the theory to acknowledge how there's an overlap of social identities, such as race, gender, sexuality, class, that contributes to a specific type of systemic oppression and discrimination experienced by a particular individual. And so for those of you that did your homework, I really appreciate it, because your positionality impacts the intersectionality of oppressive forces that you feel within your life every day. You can go to the next slide. All right, so this is how intersectionality can look. You can have a positionality where you are right in the middle. You are an immigrant, you've impacted, or your family's been impacted by criminal justice. You live in a polluted community. Either you could be gender nonconforming or just be in a different relationship. And you also could have health concerns. Mm-hmm. And the intersectionality of all of this is what's important for us to consider when we build relationships with folks, when we use language, when we communicate with folks who are experiencing all these other layers of oppression. Next slide. So environmental justice. For those that are unfamiliar with the term, here's a definition for you. It is about the fair treatment and the meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of their race, their color, or their national origin, or their income. And it is with respect to the development and the implementation and the enforcement of environmental laws. So if we were to define fair treatment, it just means that no group of people should have negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, governmental, commercial operations or policies. And meaningful involvement, as defined by the EPA, is people have an opportunity to participate in the decisions about activities that it may impact their environment and their health. That the public's contribution can influence these agencies, and that community concerns will be considered in the decision-making process. The term itself what just happened? Okay, sorry, my screen went black. The term itself was coined by Benjamin Chavez.
All right, give it just a minute. I think her computer froze.
Do we have ghosts?
We might. Give it just a minute for her. There we go. Now you're not frozen anymore, Stephanie. Can't hear you. Give us just a minute. Her got a computer issue going on. Can people hear? People can hear me, but not Stephanie, right?
Right.
Okay. Well, while she figures out her audio, let's see, I'll pick up on her side. We'll go to, let's see.
You had Ben Chavez coming up with the term.
Yeah, there we go. I'm trying to find my notes. All right. So Chavez defined the term as racial discrimination in environmental policy making, the enforcement of regulations and laws, the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste facilities, the official sanctioning of the life-threatening presence of poisons and pollutants in our communities, and the history of excluding people of color from leadership of the ecology movement. So all of these things bring us to meaningful involvement, meaning people have an opportunity to participate in decisions about activities that may affect their environment and their health. The public's contribution can influence the regulatory agency's decision. Community concerns will be considered in the decision-making process. And then decision makers will seek out and facilitate the involvement of those potentially affected. Next slide. So through the leadership of Dolly Burwell, the Reverend Leon White, and the Reverend Benjamin Chavez Jr., and the UCC's Commission for Racial Justice, the United Church of Christ served as the leading organizational force in the birth of the environmental justice movement. The story of how this movement arose begins in the late 1970s when a group of residents formed the Warren County Citizens Concerned and began to protest the state of North Carolina's designation of a landfill in their county for the disposal of PCBs, a toxic chemical substance whose production was banned by Congress in 1979. With a population that was roughly 62% Black, no other county in the state had a higher percentage of Black residents, and only a few of the state's 100 counties could claim higher poverty rates. The placement of the landfill became regarded as an instance of environmental racism, a phrase coined by Chavez. And we talked about this last week when we talked about Bella Romero and where that fracking site was positioned right outside an elementary school of predominantly children of color. So that's how we can bring that back into our local organizing. Stephanie, is your audio?
Stephanie, can you hear us? Can you hear us?
I can hear you all.
There you are. You're back. Okay. I was continuing.
It disconnected from everything. I apologize.
No worries. I kept it going.
Okay. Well, did you already get through this slide?
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
So now we're going to move on to the second part of this afternoon, talking about the following issues: youth, immigration, LGBTQIA+, pipelines, criminal justice, gender justice, and people with a disability and the elderly. Next slide. So we're going to start off talking a little bit about the youth movement. And this is one of my favorite things to highlight, is the amazing work of all of our youth who raised their collective voices in the last couple of years in a way that we have never seen before. Next slide. So youth and climate justice. So systems focused on profit instead of the planet and her people, resulting in irresponsible practices, have left today's youth with a polluted, climate change threatened, and impacted earth that they must now try to clean up to improve quality of life and mitigate the coming catastrophic conditions. Our youth will inherit our earth. Our classrooms must integrate the concept of intersectionality into instruction in order to make lessons relevant to the reality of the lives of these youth, resulting in helping students identify how they can be agents of change in their lives and in their communities. There are so many inspiring examples of youth who have seized the reins and are making a transformational impact on their communities, and we need to foster their voices more. We have youth all over the country working in the Sunrise Movement, UPOs, NAACP Youth in College, Move On, Extinction Rebellion, Future Coalition, Earth Uprising, US Youth Climate Strikes, Fridays for Future, Youth versus Apocalypse, International Indigenous Youth Council, and so many more. Next slide. These are some of our favorite youth from our frontline communities. I adore Shea Bastida, Vic Barrett, Jamie Margolin, Isra Hersey, Shukta Scott Martinez, Alexandria Villasenor, Jerome Foster, Callan Benson, and Quanah Chasing Horse. Most of these youth come from frontline communities, those suffering the worst impacts of the climate crisis and have had the climate movement intersect with some of the other aspects of their lives and identities. And with that, we have on our next slide an amazing guest speaker today. I would like to welcome Liliana Flanagan, one of our US Youth Climate Strike Colorado organizers. She organizes over on the Western Slope in Grand Junction, is a rural youth, and is so amazing at what she does. So I'm going to hand it over to Lily to talk a little bit about the youth movement.
Hello, everybody. Hopefully you all can hear me okay. As Amy said, my name is Liliana Flanagan. A little bit about me, I am a recent high school graduate, so I somehow did it in these crazy times. I organize in a couple of different capacities. So one, obviously with the youth climate movement. I am also an organizer against gun violence, youth voter turnout, community health, and just a couple other issues. So the thing about living in a rural community, I'm sure many of you, I know someone mentioned they were from Carbondale, so I'm sure you know kind of how it is to be in a small town. But the thing about organizing in a place like this is that the same people who are interested in talking about the climate are the same people who are interested in talking about all of these other issues. So I'm very fortunate that I am a part of a very, I'd like to think, well-oiled machine of young students here who try to make a change on all these different issues. So first, I just want to tell you a little bit about what I've done on a local level and then a statewide level, so that you all can kind of understand the process that we have to go through as young people when we're trying to organize within a movement like this. So the umbrella organization for a couple of our platforms is called Grand Valley Students United. We are a student coalition. Really, it's just the same kids that do all the other stuff along with me. But nonetheless, so Grand Valley Students United has put on a couple of climate strikes in the past. Between me and a couple other organizers, we have all led. And our first event was on the same day that the very first big nationwide climate strike happened. And it was very interesting because Grand Junction is, not only is it a rural community, but it's one of the reddest areas in the state of Colorado. And so it, you know, as young people trying to organize with all of these other people having dissenting opinions was a bit of a bizarre experience. Not that it hadn't happened before. And so within our process, we were realizing that, you know, we had organized in-person events before, but this was unlike anything else because this was something that people in our area just completely denied existed. And we really had no community support at the beginning. And as we've planned more events and as we've put out more content and, you know, continued to become more involved, we have started to receive, you know, some community support from the progressive community in Grand Junction, which, yes, surprise, it does exist a little bit. But we, receiving this community support, have still hit some walls that I want to tell all of you about. So when it comes to, when you see young people organizing and you want to know how to support them, there are 3 different levels, and I'll give you examples for each. So there's one in your own community. If you live in a ranch in Meeker and you still want to support the climate movement, but you can't attend an in-person event, that's the time where monetary support is very important. And I will be completely honest with you, you know, we can't necessarily contribute to our own cause as much as some of the adult organizers I've worked with before, because we do not really have stable jobs considering we are or we're high school students. So we have to compensate, as much as a good cause as it is, we have to compensate every single person who does something for us that helps us put on our events. Another example of this is this last April 22nd, this last Earth Day, when we transitioned our statewide strike from an in-person event that would have happened in Denver to a COVID-adapted online set of 3 days. We had to still compensate everybody that was doing digital work for us, people who were performing, because they are the basis of the movement. So to support young people in your community, show up to their events and support them monetarily so they can support the people who are lining this base for really everything that they're doing. Statewide, you know, I'm from the Western Slope. The other 2 co-leads were from 2 different places on the Front Range for our statewide programming. And so it really was difficult for us to try and be united because we honestly were never going to meet in person. Luckily, all 3 of us, not necessarily at the same time, but we had met each other at some point. However, it was interesting to watch, you know, 3 different students come together in 3 different, from 3 different viewpoints to organize for this unifying cause. And so that is something that you can support by communicating with people who maybe don't live close to you. I think when you try to support the efforts of young people who are trying to move things forward on the state level, you know, some of us are more focused on legislative change. Some of us are from a rural area and we want to help people from urban areas understand why it's a little bit different here when we talk to our officials. And so elevating young voices by speaking to one another, you know, we're all united toward the same movement. And I think it's really important that when you consider trying to support the efforts of young people, you make sure that you're communicating with diversity in mind. And really elevating young voices has been very important for us. We saw so many people come together as we put together our 3 days of action for the 50th anniversary of Earth Day a couple months ago. I guess it was 1 month ago, seems so far away. But I think that people elevating our voices as young people was really what made the difference, because we were able to elevate artists, we were able to elevate you know, these other young people that we've worked with, and we allowed them to speak and speak their minds. And us elevating them is the same thing that our entire community statewide can do for us. And climate change and climate justice, you know, when you talk about intersectionality, this is what's going to affect this full generation. And my generation, you know, as does any, but my generation has so many different types of people. And so it's been really nice to see all of us young organizers sort of come to a mutual understanding about, you know, this climate justice issue affects this population and this population more than another. And so ensuring that we're elevating diverse voices goes for just about any level of any generation, any, you know, level of involvement in the movement. And I've been very thankful to be, you know, given all these opportunities, you know, working with the people that I have. And I think that I've been lucky enough to be elevated. And I know there are other students who are just like me, but just haven't had the opportunity to have their voice be heard. And so really that's the most important thing that I do want to stress, is that as you elevate young voices, that's actively making a difference, whether it feels like it's going to create legislative change or not. Because you best believe we're fighting for that legislative change as those of us who are growing up are going to be affected. But if anyone has any questions or anything, or any comments as well, I'd love to answer them, because I know there's sometimes some people forget that high schoolers are normal people as well.
Yes, I have a question, Liliana.
Mm-hmm.
Is the Grand Valley Citizens United the same as the Grand Valley Citizens Alliance?
So actually a good question. So Western Colorado Alliance is a big umbrella organization, and it has given some of us the coolest boss we've ever had. Yeah, Amy knows, Amy knows what's up. But they are an umbrella organization for a lot of smaller coalitions. So Grand Valley Students United is completely student run, which means most of the time there's maybe a couple people who've just turned 18, but really it's students between like 14 and 18 years old. And so legally, we cannot have, you know, a nonprofit under our name. Or I think there was some financial, I wish I could tell you the exact statute that says that we can't have one, but you have to be 18. And so what they do is they house our financial. So they're one of our umbrella organizations. And another way that Grand Valley Students United is involved with Western Colorado Alliance is one of our platforms, one of our 5 is youth voter turnout, as I mentioned earlier. And so we, formerly Western Slope Youth Voter Initiative, we have created a program called West Slope Youth Vote, where we have been able to register, provide resources, outreach, and lobby on behalf of Grand Valley students. And that is a program that's directly through Western Colorado Alliance. So that's how the two are related. But they helped support us. Western Colorado Alliance, Conservation Colorado, and the Colorado Mesa University Sustainability Council all helped pitch in on our last 2 climate events. So we all work together, and our boss for the West Slope Youth Vote, all of that stuff has been incredibly supportive of everything we've ever done. So yeah, that's how the 2 are related. It's a really good, really good question. I saw another one, verbatim, what can us old folks do so young folks will vote? Very good question. So this West Slope Youth Vote program, obviously, I think to me, it's the pinnacle of intersectionality over here on the Western Slope. I think we've been able to bring in so many issues and so many people from a lot of different viewpoints. And I think, one, providing resources, support to that sort of outreach, I think is really important. And really, it all comes back to elevating young voices, because when young people feel heard, they are going to begin to understand that they're going to also be able to feel heard when they send in their ballot. We created West Slope Youth Vote because we knew that peer-to-peer engagement was going to be the most effective way to register young voters and provide them with the information that they need through our Rural Issues Report, which is like similar to a legislative scorecard. And so that we really figured out that the best way to engage young voters was for us to go in and talk to our peers, because I'm sure all of you have met a high schooler before, and I think if you said, hey, you should register to vote, they'd probably just kind of brush you off and move on, because I know that I would if I weren't interested in politics, to be completely honest. So it was a really great question. I think, yeah, go ahead and email me. I would really love that. And Amy put my email in the chat. Anyone is welcome to email me, reach out. And I really think that our community is a great example of how young people can be elevated, even when people aren't necessarily for exactly what you're doing. And I hope that young people here in the Grand Valley continue. I mean, after 4 years of doing what we've done, a lot of us are graduating this year, or have graduated, and we're ready to see what the next 4 years will look like for our area. So yeah, I think that's it. Did I miss anything, Amy, Stephanie? No? Okay, cool. Well, thank you guys so much for having me. Please feel free to reach out. I am here. I love to answer questions. I really want to be a resource for anyone who wants to learn more about how they can elevate young voices and how they can continue to support the climate movement through young people to ensure that your actions continue to promote intersectionality. So yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And you ended on intersectionality, which is literally the next slide that I'm going into as we dive into our next category, which is LGBTQIA community. So I just want you to close your eyes to feel comfortable, or just imagine a Black transgender woman. And I would like for you to think about what type of discrimination may she face in the workplace. And think back to the icebreaker we did in the beginning and last week in positionality. And would she face this discrimination because she's Black? Or is it because she's a transgender woman? The answer is both, right? And through a lens of intersectionality, we can see that these overlapping identities, gender identity and race, create a bigger struggle for the trans woman. And generally, trans women of color face prejudices, sometimes homophobia, sexism, racism inside and outside of the workplace. Next slide. So we're going to dive into 3 categories of vulnerabilities that we see at the intersection of the LGBTQ community and, oh, sorry, I'm a slide ahead. I got excited. Okay. As we're learning about the concepts like environmental racism and environmental sexism, in other words, the ways that climate change intersects with racism and sexism, it really helped me understand the ways that oppression is totally experienced. And so homelessness is a problem that plagues the LGBTQ community. When I was organizing in South Central Los Angeles, it was very prevalent just in canvassing and talking to folks that especially queer youth who like come out to their families and they've been put out of their homes. And so according to the True Colors Fund, a nonprofit focusing on LGBTQ youth homelessness, LGBTQ young people are 100% more likely to experience homelessness. According to this report, it was released by the organization in 2015, so it is a little outdated. It said that the youth made up around 40% of the homeless population in the United States, with the majority of people being either gay or lesbian or transgender women of color. Next slide. So there's 3 categories of vulnerabilities we're going to go over today. The first one is economic. So economic here, as you can see, we have on the slide, is around that there was no public or private employment discrimination protection. The lack of protection leaves LGBTQ communities economically vulnerable. It was evident in like the discriminatory policy that faced communities of disadvantage before Katrina made landfall. Around economic capital is the ability of an individual population to build financial capital. And the important thing that we must consider when we talk about economic is also wage discrimination. Next slide. All right, so if we go into housing, even apart from the disastrous destruction, property rights are significant to society. Homes represent investment, livelihood, status, and memory. If we're talking about specifically, the source of this information is coming from Hurricane Katrina, and they say that there's a Louisiana policy discriminated against LGBTQ communities in the housing market before the hurricane, and that the Louisiana Equal Housing Opportunity Act allowed discriminatory housing practices that were based on sexual orientation and gender. Next slide. And so the last category is health. There is a lack of legal recognition of same-sex partnerships on the state and federal level, especially during Hurricane Katrina in cases where one partner was hospitalized and the other partner was not guaranteed visitation rights. There are examples like this all over the country. They may have been in a committed relationship for years, they may own a house together, and they may even have children together, but none of this has any bearing. And it is up to the discretion. And when you're in a time of need and you're trying to make life and death situations, it can be very problematic that this relationship isn't viewed as being valued from the institution. And so when we talk about institutional oppression and how folks are living underneath different lenses of oppression, health is a major one that comes up. And then I will pass this to Amy.
Yes. So now we're going to talk a little bit in this section about pipelines and how that intersects with the climate movement and every other movement. You know, the urgency is real. Environmental justice struggles continue to intensify, as do related risks to socio-environmental equity and environmental health. Issues of equity and environmental justice stand at the nexus of these intersecting socio-environmental problems. And as we face multiple interconnected and overlapping socio-environmental dilemmas, we have to figure out how we will treat each other. And pipelines are one of the examples of this. Issues, you know, in response to this, people use deeply intersectional, innovative strategies to resist environmental injustices. For example, the coalition that developed across all interest groups and among Indigenous people around the Standing Rock oil pipeline, those protests displayed the deep intersectionality of contemporary environmental justice activism. And with that, the response to that by the systems of oppression was to enact pipeline protest laws in response to a lot of these frontline fights. Next slide. So this is just a quick graphic on the criminalization of climate protests and resistance. Since the events at Standing Rock, there's a trend in states with conservative governors and state legislators to implement laws criminalizing civil disobedience. There's the creation of new city codes that prohibit or fine public assembly over a certain number of people. And as we're seeing right now, this is how this intersects with what's going on right now. Protesters are often treated like violent criminals. Were taken violently from tree sits, attacked on Indigenous land with water cannons and LRAD, rubber bullets, tear gas, mace. And this is going on right now across the country. You know, and then they're detaining and setting unreasonably high bails to prevent the release or continued protests. So this map kind of shows you where those things are that have passed, some that are pending, and the ones that have failed. And as you can see, Colorado's in that fail category, which is what I like to see. Next slide. So I would love a volunteer. If someone wanted to just make this a little more interactive, if somebody wanted to read this slide.
I can.
Perfect.
Whether by conscious design or institutional neglect, communities of color in urban ghettos, in rural poverty pockets, or on economically impoverished Native American reservations face some of the worst environmental devastation in the nation. Dr. Robert Ballard, father of environmental justice.
Thank you very much. Next slide. So that brings us to violence against Indigenous women, girls, and people that are fueled by fossil fuel man camps. This is another part of intersectional activism and things that relate to pipeline fights. When these oil companies come into these areas to put in fossil fuel infrastructure, as you can see by the background picture in this slide, these are what are called man camps. And this is where all the workers live and where equipment is kept and all of those things near communities and near reservations. And a lot of Indigenous women, girls, and people go missing around man camps. They are violently assaulted. And the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement has come about a lot in the last few years. But the median age of a missing and murdered Indigenous person is 29. There were 506 were identified across 71 selected urban cities. 128 were cases of missing women. 280 were cases of murdered Indigenous women. And 98 were cases with an unknown status. Next slide. So 1 in 3 Native women have experienced rape or attempted rape, and approximately 90% of these attacks are carried out by non-Natives. This means someone in the community surrounding or in a man camp. And only 13% reported by Native women actually result in an arrest, as opposed to 35% reported by Blacks result in arrest, and 32% reported by white result in arrest. But even if, and this is an important thing to note, even if it is reported, Tribal courts have no jurisdiction over non-natives. There's only on our land. And in 2016, 5,712 Indigenous women and girls were reported missing, but only 116 were logged by the U.S. Department of Justice's Federal Missing Persons Database. This is another part of all of this, that our girls and women and people go missing, and there is no accountability, and there's not any oversight by the federal government because they put profit over people. And it's a huge problem in our communities, and not a lot of action towards it. And we were gonna have our good friend Tomas Lopez from International Indigenous Youth Council and Future Coalition speak this afternoon during this portion, but they are on the front lines of the movement this week, and let me know that they might not be able to make it to this call. So we're gonna skip over slide 26, unless for some reason, Tomas, you jumped on while I was talking. I don't see you in the, so we'll skip to slide 27, and I'll hand it back over to Stephanie. I'll continue until she gets back. So now we're gonna move on. We're gonna talk a little bit about immigration and climate-induced migration and displacement. Next slide. So migration is a human right. We all know this. But a lot of people in power don't share that same perspective. But between states, regions, and countries, as areas become less habitable and local economies crash, we're gonna see a massive influx of migration due to climate change. And this is because of sea level rise, because of droughts and fires. We all saw what happened with the last couple of hurricanes and the massive wildfires in California in the last couple of years are making those kind of places inhabitable. Severe storms and hurricanes right now we're in the middle of a pandemic, a massive uprising, and we're about to start hurricane season. So it can be very scary for communities, especially communities that are already under attack. Lost property, the drinking water will become unsafe. Crop loss and agriculture will become much harder, loss of tourism. So many of these different things. Next slide. So displacement of Indigenous communities and other vulnerable coastal communities. Indigenous and Alaskan Native communities. Oh, there you are. Are you back? Stephanie, is that you? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Most of the people currently dealing with climate change induced relocation are Indigenous American on native this land, and then Alaskan natives living close to coastal resources. As they plan for and undertake their moves, these communities are at the edge of, the cutting edge of challenging legal and policy issues, particularly those involving land acquisition, rights to evacuated property and funding. Community history adds a layer of complexity to all this. And it makes these communities more vulnerable to sea level rise because they live close to coasts because of the cultural and economic importance of coastal resources, or because the federal government forcibly settled them on tracts of land that were much smaller and more marginal to their original homelands. And in this way, the circumstances and options for land acquisition and governance by tribal entities reflect the particularly strained history and political relationship between these communities and the federal and state governments of the United States. Next slide. So international immigration also plays into this. According to a UN report on immigration from Central America, especially the dry corridor. It has spiked since 2014 when the droughts began. Invasive insects, potentially increased by climate, have devastated nearby pine forests, adding to heat increases and damaging water quality and resources from loss of trees. Food has become more scarce, giving residents of these places no other choice than to leave. Next slide. This is just a couple visuals to add to the slide deck about what the Bahamas looked like after Hurricane Dorian, and what happened to Puerto Rico during Hurricane Maria, and the absolute failure of our government to support and help these communities to reassemble and to recover from natural disasters. Next slide. And this brings us to immigration policy. The US is one of the largest contributors to climate change and responsible for the many disparities in frontline communities globally, which is fueling the immigration crisis. Rather than addressing the root of the problem by curbing our emissions, under this administration, weakening environmental protections and targeting immigrants that have no other option but to migrate and will keep coming. And then for this portion of the afternoon, we have, next slide, invited my very good friend, Ian Thomas-Tafoya from Green Latinos, to talk to you this afternoon. And with that, I will hand it over.
Hey, Amy, how long do I have? I almost forgot about this next one.
No, it's fine. 5 to 8 minutes or whatever you want, whatever you need. You take the space you need.
All right. Well, I appreciate that, and I just want to take a minute and to send my heartfelt thoughts to the people like Tomas who are on the front lines. I've been out there trying to exercise my right to pick up and support people by not giving our leaders the opportunity to complain about the trash as a reason for more excessive police violence. And I think that police violence is a great transition here, and I appreciate, and actually if you could go back to the slide that's not me and to the slide that has to do with people in cages. And I think that that's so freaking relevant here that I don't really, whether we're talking about our children or we're talking about the men in our families or the women in our families or the transgender people in our families, you know, all you need to do is go take a look at the book, The New Jim Crow and the Mass Incarceration and Age of Colorblindness to see how Black people, how Latino people, how indigenous peoples are the ones that are making up a majority of the people in prison, including many of my relatives. And so this is a personal fight for me, and I apologize y'all that I don't have a set of prepared slides because I was so busy in the fight this weekend trying to respond to the success of police violence. But I think I really want to talk about a few things here that I think intersect when it comes to climate and immigration. And the first one I want to talk about is about Black Lives Matter in particular, because we know that the people in the Southern Hemisphere are going to be the ones that are going to be the most drastically impacted. Not only are they least prepared because of the infrastructure they have, they're already seeing the early effects of desertification and some of these other issues that are directly related to climate change, famine, flooding, drought, you name it. And so we know that the people who have darker skin than the people who live in the Northern Hemisphere are going to be the ones that are taking the blunt of this. And, you know, when we get in these fights about climate policy, it's often the Southern Hemisphere who's trying to ask for information sharing when it comes to technology so that they can advance their technology and not have to burn fossil fuels and not have to follow the same path towards industrialization as the first world country has, and the developed country has. And, you know, they run into struggles there. And so then we point our fingers at them. But let's not forget that the military industrial complex is the #1 polluter in the world. And I agree with this right off the bat, what Amy was saying, which was that, you know, the U.S. government is wholly responsible. And we, as the people who drive and direct the U.S. government, are wholly responsible for trying to reshape this by defunding militarization and war and police war on civilians and reallocating those dollars for climate migration. You know, there's going to be a whole lot of forced migration that's going to happen as a result of climate change. And I think the one thing that Amy led with, or these slides led with, that people should have the right to migrate, I can tell you that I am Hickory Apache, my people, and the people of this continent and the southern continent, we're constantly moving. And I shouldn't even say this continent. I think people all across the world, we're constantly moving for resources. Whether you have water, we know there are cycles that we don't have control over, solar cycles, 22 years long, that are going to affect weather patterns. And that's why people range from places to place. And that's why cultures adapted for different conditions. And so they would migrate and move into space as the climate would allow. You know, in the 90s, there were a lot of immigrants, Mexican immigrants, that came here to Colorado that directly relate to drought that was occurring in central Mexico. Zacatecas, Durango. These are places where we saw a lot of immigrants come in the 90s, and there was a huge backlash, even within Latinos personally. You know, we saw a lot of second, third generation Latinos or indigenous people whose families had been forced assimilated, who have ultimately reached a place where they had felt like at least they had found some system place in the society. And then, you know, the overt racism is something that moves in and out between my culture. I think that colorism also plays a part in mine. You know, Green Latinos is very clear that we believe that Latinx, Latinos is a culture, it's not a color. There are people that look all different ways, but share values that are centered in the earth, that are centered in our families, and are centered in art and culture. And we are constantly trying to be supportive of our indigenous ancestors, whether you are Latinx, Latino, Hispanic, Boricua, Apache. These are all names that were applied to us. They were our own names for ourselves, and we've had to take some ownership of them, much like you see Black people take ownership of theirs, of words that are used derogatory against them, that they begin to take and to take ownership of. Chicano is a perfect example that I've seen in my family. You know, when it comes to immigration and farm workers, these workers are already migrating on a regular basis. They keep their families at home, often in Mexico, if they or if they can bring them, they bring them. But there are people who are moving from place to place already, doing service and doing essential work for you and for me. And we need to recognize that and fight for them. In this COVID crisis, one of Donald Trump's administration's solution is to offer farmers relief by paying farm workers less. I don't know if you know this, but farm workers aren't even protected under minimum wage working standards. We had a fight and protest in front of our own Colorado government to get them 10-minute breaks, and they don't even have to be consecutive 10 minutes every 4 hours. My family I can tell you my family, when they would march with Cesar, for Cesar and with Cesar here in Colorado, that they would arrest children and hold people and put whole families in jail to try to quell these protests that are related to this. We know that climate change is going to bring more change. We know that people are going to have to move. I saw a question here from my friend and colleague Theron about how we can take people in. But we've seen how we can. Hurricane Katrina, I dated a woman who came here from the University of Colorado Boulder. But what I have to be clear about is, you know, if we're going to hope to house and save the people that are going to have to migrate, we're going to have to start fighting for housing for the people who are here now, right? If there's not housing for people here now, how are we supposed to take on immigrants? Whether they're American immigrants or migrants, or whether they're from here, we're going to have to tackle that. And housing inequity is directly related to this economic inequity and job inequity that comes from this criminal justice system. Once a felon, always a felon. Legal discrimination at will. Check the box, can't live here, can't live here. It forces people into situations where they have to go underground instead of participating. And we know, like, example with the homeless, when we force them underground with camping bans, we know more harm and damage is done. Rapes, murders, stealing, theft. Same with our immigrant community. Abuse and violence, and not feeling like they can come forward to report that. You know, all these things are going to be exacerbated as this goes on. And then I just want to, well, the last point I really want to make, well, two really, and it has to do with economics. It really has to do with economics. When I look at what happened in New Orleans years ago with Hurricane Katrina, all I could think to myself was this was an example of hubris that the Greeks wrote about. For us to pour millions of dollars into rebuilding underneath sea level, when we see what's happening in Miami, the massive gentrification and expansion in places that are underwater, it makes absolutely no sense to me. And I think it would be smarter for us to redirect these efforts redirect these dollars into laying out migratory patterns to bring people away from harm's way on the coast, which we know is going to happen. And then just lastly, I read a book in university that I think is a really powerful book that is called The Globalization Paradox. And it talks about how we have the ability to move capital very quickly from one place to another, but we don't have the ability to move visas and to move people in the same way. And so examples are, in this book, are how they took a lot of Indian workers from India to Africa to work on projects that are financed by the Chinese. But then when the market shifts, when there's climate disaster, when there's instability in the markets, when they can't channelize their products, they pull the capital. And within days, people are unemployed, just like they're unemployed by this pandemic within days. We see what the fallout of this is. And so we're going to have to work not only in our own state, in our own country, and in our own region, but globally to figure out how we can move people with dignity and respect. Because these encampments that are for refugees on the borders of everywhere along this planet, including our own economic refugees, the homeless, do not have access to water for COVID, don't have access for waste to dispose of themselves. We're not allowing human dignity. And the most important thing that we can do right now is to allow human dignity to re-enter our conversations in the way we police ourselves, the way we fund ourselves, and the way we build our infrastructure.
Thank you so much, Ian, for being here this afternoon. And as he was talking, I was thinking about the very first organization that I volunteered for was United Farm Workers. And I was 16 or 17 years old, and the community I grew up in was predominantly farm workers. And I was drawn to doing that work because I saw what was going on around me in my community and how my neighbors were treated and how much they struggled. So that was incredibly powerful, Ian. And then I'll hand it back over to Stephanie.
Could I just tag on to something that Ian said? Would that be okay? David Clowney, I thank you so much for saying so much so quickly. And I just wanted to add that there is a country in the world that is basically would be underwater, and that's the Netherlands. And that people did invite Dutch folks over after Katrina to talk about what might be done to make New Orleans and that part of Louisiana sustainable. And the Dutch knew how to do it, and they told us, but nobody was willing to spend the money. So it's sort of like, could we stay here sustainably in harmony with the environment? Yeah, but we're not willing to pay for it, let alone think about how to rebuild the communities and take care of the people that are there.
Thank you, David.
Well, you're welcome. I hope I didn't just
No, it's okay. We'll get back on track. I just wanted to leave any space for Ian if he wanted to respond or had anything else to say before we move on. Otherwise, I'll hand it back over to Stephanie for our next session. Can't hear you again.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. All right, I'm getting the hang of this. So the next section we're going into is criminal justice. And I really just want to thank Ian for bringing up the Black Lives Matter movement as we transition into this section of criminal justice. This small segment is a part of a larger segment that Mothers Out Front does, where we dive into white supremacy culture and how the criminal justice system was developed around a way to contain people of color as they were given their freedom to exist in this country. So, but we're specifically going to focus on criminal justice and its intersection with environmental justice and climate change. And so when we think about that, I usually go to natural disasters examples as some of the examples I gave in the past were around Katrina. We can often see criminalization of victims due to disaster. There was shootings of survivors on the bridge in New Orleans is one of the most stark examples that I remember. Even more where there were tornadoes in Alabama that saw issues arising around profiling people of color when police have heightened vigilante work around looting, right? And then that transcends, because history repeats itself, that this whole reframing and using language for something that a Black person does or a person of color does in comparison to their counterpart have completely different meanings, right? And we've seen that on social media in regards to looting or vandalizing, or some people would say retribution, right? It's like taking back what's ours. Next slide. Next slide.
Jenna, next, there we go.
Okay, thank you. So this is just an image here. It's really in regards to a case of Marcus Santos. I don't know if anyone has heard of him. He was a healthy man that went to a state correctional institution in South Carolina. It was a maximum security prison. And in February 2012, by the third year of his 5 to 10 year sentence, he feared for his life. But he didn't fear for his life in a way of being harmed by inmates. He feared for his life because he had developed a host of severe medical problems: skin rashes, partial vision loss, swelling in his throat, and he worried whether he would ever see his 13-year-old son again. Santos kept detailed notes of all his symptoms. That's what makes this case very interesting. He underwent numerous emergency medical procedures over those first few years in jail. Mind you, I said he went to jail healthy. He eventually got transferred to another facility where his condition improved, but everyone who stayed back at Fayette, those fellow prisoners were experiencing those same symptoms: routine headaches, dizziness, fatigue, respiratory tract problems, thyroid disorders. Now, Dustin McDaniel, he was an executive director of the Abolitionist Law Center. He says that you could look at a Google map of the prison and see how it's surrounded by coal ash dump. It's just blindingly obvious that this is a really bad idea. So through a year-long investigation in coordination with the Human Rights Coalition, the Law Center, based in Pittsburgh, about an hour from the alarming rates of illness, the prisoners to be consistent with exposure to coal ash. The prisoners' immediate surroundings, according to the investigations, were they cannot escape the exposure. It included about 40 million tons of waste, 2 coal slurry ponds, and millions of cubic yards of coal combustion waste. Findings like these have led a group of town members to challenge the polluters in court. So when we talk about criminal justice and its intersectionality with environmental justice, also just choosing placement to build your prisons in places where you know the inmates will be exposed to high levels of pollution, high rates of coal ash, is a human rights issue. Because if someone's only supposed to serve 5 years, and those whole 5 years they're feeling dizziness, having inability to have good vision, if they had any other underlying condition, that may be a fatal sentence. So it's just really important that when we talk about intersectionality in regards to criminal justice, often we talk about the pipeline that creates folks to behave a way, but we also have to talk about the inhumane conditions that people are held in. Next slide. So there is a lead crime hypothesis, and it is proposed that there's a link between elevated blood levels in children and increased rates of crime, delinquency, and recidivism later in their life. Lead is widely understood to be toxic to multiple organs of the body, particularly the brain. Next slide. So here is that link. So when we talk about lead paint, it can lead to childhood lead poisoning. Now we know that lead poisoning, this is a common knowledge. If anyone wants to push back or has questions, feel free to do so in the chat. But we know that there are things around learning disabilities, speech disorders, lower IQ, behavioral disorders, health problems, hyperactivity. Now, when we talk about the effects of the child's future, we know that there can be lifelong health problems, academic failure, employment difficulties, socialization problems, and a criminal record. Now, the effects to society, it'll cause a spike in healthcare costs in a particular area, unemployment, the juvenile justice system, a need to invest more in special education. Right, next slide.
Sorry, one more. There we go.
Okay. I thought it was just my computer.
No, we got one off.
Okay. So when we talk about criminal justice, and as Ian brought up, like police brutality and the mass incarceration of people of color, I really like to share the story of Corin Gaines in Baltimore County. If you really don't know the story around it, Gaines reported aggressive behavior surrounding her arrest in March and an agitated visit she paid, and she video recorded when she went to the police station in April. And she refused to put down her gun during 5 hours of cajoling from trained negotiators. And her boyfriend on Monday are indicators of possibly a manic state. So she went into the police station, recording herself with a gun for 5 hours. And Gaines herself provided a plausible explanation for why she might be that way when it comes to her being in a possibly a manic state. In a 2012 lawsuit, so this is separate from her going in there, in a 2012 lawsuit claiming she suffered from lead paint poisoning. So prior to this moment in time where she went into the police station with a gun, she was in the middle of claiming a lawsuit in regards to lead poisoning. There's actually a Washington Post piece by Terrence McCoy, and I can send a link out. It's an award-winning piece, and it talks about the life and lead poisoning of Freddie Gray, and how horrible lead poisoning was for the poor and ultimately entirely Black families in Baltimore who lived in the 1970s era apartments. It's a depressing read, but it's real. And it really talks about how we're intentionally targeted. So starting 4 years before, she came exposed to a sea of lead paint. It made her very ill. Doctors examined her, found that she continued to display signs of neurocognitive impairment. She lost significant IQ points as a result of that exposure. And from April 1993 to November 1994, she tested high in levels of lead, according to court records. She moved to another house that also tested high for lead. So now we're talking about like that housing discrimination. She's trying to move from one place to another and both are contaminated. So she lived there for 4 years. And that's what the lawsuit alleged. And her suit, she said that they stated that she had problems with anger and she had impulsive behavior. And she had several sessions with her school counselor. It also was noted that she had trouble concentrating in school, and she still had trouble concentrating as a result of the exposure. Her attorneys argued that she suffered impairments, and she had lost IQ points. And at the time of her death, this was still pending against Baltimore. And so when we talk about police brutality and we talk about why Black and brown children may respond in a more erratic way, and we think about the intersection into climate change, we have to understand that like being poisoned doesn't make you feel good. Like it doesn't make you happy. It makes it very difficult for you to concentrate. You may be in a state of rage. And so when we really think about intersectionality when it comes to this, we have to acknowledge that like pollution is poison. And poison doesn't help our babies feel good. It doesn't help them develop, and it doesn't help them become adults who can make decisions rationally, because all of their adolescent life, they were being poisoned. And so she's always a story I like to bring up because she had an active legal case when her life was taken. Next slide. And so in the link that we'll share out, I will send the link to the article that's about Freddie Gray's life as a study of the effects of lead paint on poor Blacks. The sources here in the slide deck through the Washington Post. It's a really good read. Once you hear the symptoms, you may think of children that you know that you love that show and display those symptoms. For me, it was very triggering. I have a lot of nieces and nephews who live in communities that are heavily impacted. And once you see and acknowledge what these symptoms are and how counselors treat those systems in regards to the high school to prison pipeline, you can really see the intersectionality into climate change, into environmental justice. Next slide. I want to be cognizant of time because I could go on talking about the whole Freddie Gray thing for another 5 minutes of his story. So we're going to dive into elders and people with disabilities, and I know that we don't have a lot of time, and it was not intentional, but this is just a very important group. I'm someone who's a caretaker for both of generations of elders in my family. So we can go to the next slide. So when we talk about elders in our community, the oldest, climate change has the potential to affect the environment in a number of ways. That place increases stress on everyone, but disproportionately on the most vulnerable populations. We've talked about the young, but also we cannot forget to talk about our elders, those with chronic diseases. Older people are amongst the most at risk. We've seen this with COVID. And it's not necessarily because they're unhealthy. It can be because of these underlying health conditions. It can be because of decreased mobility resulting from age, changes in your body, restricted access to resources. Not everyone has Meals on Wheels, right? And so the inability to have a healthy diet consistently. The challenges older people will face adapting to climate change have potentially far-reaching implications for the health of individuals and the population as a whole. So there are social and economic factors. They increase these vulnerabilities of some older people because socioeconomic disadvantage restrict the capacity of individuals to avoid the negative health impacts. Not everyone has the privilege to eat organic, or that even organic can be delivered to their door. And what are those long-term effects of not having access to healthy foods or living in a food desert? That's one of the first things that got me involved in environmental justice, was delivering fruits and vegetables to a mobile elderly because we lived in a food desert. Next slide. So 1 in 7 people in the world have some sort of disability. But like women and like indigenous communities and other marginalized groups, they are routinely left out of conversations. Or if they are at the table, they're often discredited or spoken over due to unconscious or explicit bias. With the unique insights about their own situation and barriers, people with disabilities have important roles to play in proposing creative and relevant solutions to improve their communities and protect our shared planet. People with disabilities are frequently deprived of their rights. They face stigmatization and discrimination, and they're uniquely affected by the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation. Pollution and unsafe jobs in environmentally destructive industries not only affect health, but they can also cause permanent disabilities. there are policies to mitigate the impacts of environmental degradation, frequently fail to consider disability rights. A prime example is when they do these last-minute evacuation alerts without creating a plan on how to assist mobile people in their ability to evacuate. We've seen that in regards to tornadoes, in regards to hurricanes, that we really definitely see it in natural disasters. And where is your planning in ensuring that folks who are immobile, who stay at home by themselves, have a plan to be able to get to a safe area? And there's more link to more reading on that, but I just want to make sure that I'm able to give the next guest speaker time to speak before we get to a hard stop.
And with that, we'll go to the next slide and turn it over to Amalia. Welcome.
Hi there. I'm one of the leaders for 350 Jeffco and 350 Denver. And I came to this movement partially because of my various disabilities and issues and the ways in which it became clear to me how much they intersected with environmental problems. I have asthma, I have ADHD, dyslexia. Somewhere along the way, we don't know when exactly, I was exposed to Lyme disease, which also triggered autoimmune issues, and a mast cell disorder, which is an allergic disorder, which means that basically I have too many cells that produce histamine, and so I can hit anaphylaxis very easily and over a wide variety of things. I'm also bi, gender fluid, a survivor of childhood abuse and neglect. My eyes don't work together. I have joint damage from Lyme and unusual genetics. The Lyme also caused severe weight gain, and arguably that was never diagnosed. I may also be autistic. Many girls with autism are not recognized in our system today. I previously suffered severe depression and migraines as well from the whole mess, more days than not, and I'm also a survivor of sex assault. So I share all of that to emphasize that it's not just one thing, that these things pile on, and not just additionally, they're sort of exponentially impacting people out in the world that often have several things going on, and any one of those is a significant challenge, but you add them together and you get, you know, quite the mess to sort of wade through. Those various problems of mine have had a variety of climate-related impacts. Heat can cause anaphylaxis for me. So a warming climate means that I am more susceptible to dying from my allergic disorder. It also causes severe fatigue and pain from lupus, which is one of my autoimmune issues. Toxins like those from oil and gas can trigger anaphylaxis as well, migraines, pain, and other issues for me. And the things that those products are used in also, many people don't realize that the industries in charge of cosmetics and things like perfumes are almost unregulated. And so they use things like benzene, which is a byproduct of fracking, to fix fragrances. So all of those fragrance products that you're using may or may not be safe fragrances for someone like me. Some of them may be done with essential oils that I'm not allergic to, and they're fine, but many of them are, you know, literally dangerous. And that has had a variety of impacts as well, like that I cannot ride a bus. So all of the climate proposals that, you know, busing will save us, those don't work for me because it's too dangerous for me to be on a bus. Other things that have impacted me, I also use a CPAP machine to sleep at night because my unusual genetics make it more likely that my airways collapse. And so I can die of a lack of oxygen if I don't have uninterrupted power. And so in a climate disaster situation where there's fires or floods or things like that, I am a lot more likely to die in my sleep if I don't have access to uninterrupted power. There's also maintenance meds needs, which often are severely impacted by disasters, and many people with disabilities have maintenance medications that they need to be on. Also, the Lyme disease and various things have left me with really bad joints in a variety of places, including my knees. So everybody who's like, let's increase all the bike lanes and biking will save us. Well, it will help some people, but I can't ride a bike. And if the person who's driving the pram that carries me, is wearing perfume, I may not even be able to ride inside the carriage part of somebody else riding a bike. So there's a whole lot of sort of complicated issues that overlap that we have to figure out, how we address on the subject. People with disabilities have trouble fleeing from disasters. We have, like me personally, I've had an inability to fit in and even drive compact electric vehicles, both for joint reasons and because Lyme disease has caused weight problems for me. We also need a lot more warning of problems, as she touched on, so that we have time to get extra medications, to adapt to the things we need, to arrange the extra transportation and things that we need. And we often don't get that information. We're often, and I personally am limited by air quality as to the activities that I can participate in. As an adult, I can to some extent hide indoors, but as a young person, for example, it made gym class just hell on earth because I was miserable any day that there was high pollution. And this was all during the era of, lead gasoline, and everything was polluted. And so, there was no escaping it, and I was just miserable. But nobody really understood what was going on, so there were no exceptions made for me. And that's an issue too, is that many of us who are sick or disabled are not diagnosed quickly, especially if we're female. It often takes many years for us to get the accurate diagnosis, and so we often just have to suffer with it while people are very unforgiving about whatever things we can't do well. All of the toxic chemical exposures tend to make my allergic disorder much more volatile and deadly. If I go up to take pictures, I like to photograph for the cause, and if I go up and take pictures of a fracking site, I spend the next 2 days having to be really, really careful about histamine exposure so that I don't hit anaphylaxis. Biocide exposures from, glyphosate and other things like that are particularly damaging to my body and cause severe digestive and brain fog and pain problems. Everything I need to survive is an order of magnitude more expensive. I am lucky to have a husband who makes a lot of money, but there are many people who are disabled who, are homeless because the disability is impossible to get. We're usually denied on our first attempt. Many people can't afford the lawyer to go back and try again. And so we end up homeless because we don't have a way to deal with all of the expenses of our lives. And the fact that, all of these things have combined and made it so that I am incredibly sick if I eat conventional agriculture food. If I don't eat the organic stuff, I'm miserable, but the organic stuff is incredibly expensive. And so, there are people in this situation who get fewer and fewer foods they can eat and get sicker and sicker because they can't even afford the organics. I've been passed over for jobs. There's a million small-scale policy assumptions that are ableist about what normal looks like and how much time, effort, and pain it will cost someone to adhere to their whatever policies. In organizing spaces, people love to specify the method and not the result, which often I can't comply with for one of a variety of reasons. And the world tends to gaslight us about what we have, the idea that we don't really have the problems we have, or that we don't really have the needs that we have. Or they just tell us that whatever we need is impossible, even though often we get into situations where, like, COVID-19 has proven many of the things that we were told were impossible were not at all impossible. Everybody can do video conferencing. Everybody can do a variety of things that we have been asking for years, but we were just not made important enough on the subject. Non-neurotypical people also sometimes have prescriptive processes that they give us and that we can't handle, basically. So, there's a lot of like tracking and sort of process related behaviors that we're just bad at. And so being told you have to follow this process is often a way to marginalize us out of movements like the climate movement. I tend to wade in and fight with people and say I'm not going to have to do that process. But then, of course, in some scenarios, I come across as too combative and difficult to work with because, you know, I have to have all of these fights with people endlessly about why that doesn't work because they don't think in those terms. We're often excluded from leadership opportunities because of ableist requirements like participating in retreats or simple technology switch reasons like conferences or video calling and arbitrary rules about meetings in person instead of joining in other ways. Team building stuff is often extremely exclusionary. And we're not a monolith too. People with disabilities have all kinds of different disabilities, which may in fact, you know, impact their mobility or their brain function or their eyesight or their ability to hear. And so all of us have different needs and we all need somebody who's willing to speak up about that and, you know, push for the things that we need to be included. So while we're often described as, you know, one minority, we're really at least 50 minorities with different issues, and we all need to be considered. Some other ways that the whole thing impacts me related to climate is that we have all these events at all of these functions that serve food, and I have a lot of food allergies, so it's dangerous for me to even show up. I tend to show up anyway, but I can't eat the food, so I'm always sort of left out of that camaraderie and culture of sharing food together. And it's always kind of awkward as people are offering me whatever thing that I could never possibly eat. So there's a lot of ways that all of these things intersect and that people don't realize that people with disabilities, you know, are going to have a really hard time wading in for the climate cause. And it's really important that when we do, people who are working with us do their very best to not kind of dismiss it or minimize it or get frustrated that we have to argue a lot because, you know, there's a lot that we're facing and we have a lot of challenges to fight through. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Amalthea. Appreciate your perspective as always. All right, we'll move on to the next slide. All right, so it was gonna be a breakout group, but in the interest of time, we are a little bit over already. Thank you everyone for sticking with us, for going over time as we usually do. But just in the chat, we'll share in the chat, can you think of one intersectional issue that we've covered that is impacting your life right now? So go ahead and pop those in the chat when you have a chance.
And I know that you may have multiple, but just one is fine.
And while people are popping those in the chat, I'm gonna hand it back over to Stephanie to move on to the next slide so we can get finished up in a timely manner and respect everyone's time.
Alrighty, so some practical steps to organize in an intersectional way. We always like to make sure we give you steps so you can leave this feeling positive and that there is hope, and we all can make a difference. So one, recognize the difference. We have to avoid oversimplified language. Analyze the space you occupy and if it's a safe space and if you're actually taking a risk. Often we choose to activate in our comfort zones, but is that truly activating across race and class? Seek other points of view. Understand that your positionality is your positionality, and no one may have the exact positionality as you, which means they don't have the same lived experience. And I really appreciate those who did their homework and shared about someone they love in their positionality in this world. Show up. Don't make assumptions. Assumptions is what got Mr. Floyd killed. Someone assumed his $20 bill was fake, and it wasn't. And they made an assumption. Would everyone get that same assumption made against them? Probably not, especially on $20. Change the narrative. Lift up intersectionalities while organizing and activate for teaching EJ in your classrooms. And avoid the trendy fad of going green, because in itself, going green is a privilege. Next slide. So this is just to remind you that intersectionality can be anything, and you can put all of these different issues and see where they interconnect, and just know that folks exist at different interconnections. Next slide. So do you want to open this up for questions, or do you want to go over the next slide first? No? Okay. Next slide. If you have any questions, put them in the chat, and we can try to answer them or address them in the next training. So our next training is Wednesday the 10th, same time, same login, and we will dive deeper into the intersections in Colorado around health, water, food, education, and economics. Following this, with Mothers Out Front, we have a series of trainings that we do, eco training series. Today, we have our macro systems of oppression. We do a micro systems of oppression. For those of you that really want to dive into ally and accompliceness, that is June 17th. We have our Did I Say That? Implicit bias training, which is very helpful. We dive into language and an assumptive. And environmental justice. So we'll dive more into the history. There's environmental racism as well as climate justice 101. Those are all of our facilitators from all over the country. And feel free to join us. And I hope to see you there. And I'll pass it back to Amy.
All right, so some of the questions in the chat. We will be sending out a follow-up email. After this, we got to get the video uploaded to YouTube, but as soon as we get that done, we'll send out a follow-up email with the recording, with this slide deck, with all the links, and with ways that you can get involved with 350 Colorado and with Mothers Out Front. I see a lot of questions in the chat about, you know, those kind of things, so I thought I'd blanket address all of those, that you will get ways to get involved, how you can contact us, and all the things you need to dive deeper into these. And then, yes, our next session is next Wednesday, but that is never the end for Stephanie and I together doing webinars. We will be doing some more of these coming up in the future. So besides all of these, we'll keep you posted on some amazing things coming up that you can join. And then we will also send out the emails of our speakers today so that you can ask them questions or contact them, or, you know, if you want to get involved in supporting something that they're working on, we will send that out in our email as well. And I would like to give a big shout out and a big thank you to our guest speakers for being here today. Thank you so much for your amazing perspectives, for all your work on the front lines and everything you do to support the movement. We are forever grateful to you as always. Next slide. So thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. And I hope that we will see you again next Wednesday and at future trainings. And for those of us going out onto the front lines in the next week, please stay safe. Go in pairs. If you need resources for going to the front lines, please feel free to ask myself or Stephanie for advice on how to best support the Black Lives Matter movement. Do we have any homework?
I guess our only homework would be the homework for folks who didn't complete from last week. Because as many participants that we had, not everyone did their homework, guys.
Hey, some of us did it, we just didn't send it. We did it, we just didn't send it. Shame.
Well, still, I would say do it again. It should have been very healing for you to touch base with like people that you love and just be honest with them. Be like, hey, I was in a training and it was talking about positionality. And I know that I'm a woman, I'm a Black woman, I'm biracial, my husband's a military spouse, and I have all these existences I've lived under. And just ask them to share, you know, and you'll be surprised, especially with younger youth, they'll just open up and tell you everything. And just come back ready to talk.
Is the homework from last week posted? I was in the middle of all sorts of other stuff and just completely forgot, but it's in the email where I can get it.
Yeah, it's in the email that we sent after the one last week, and I will also send it again in this follow-up email for those people who didn't get it done or wanted to continue to expand on that healing process. I'll send it out again.
Thanks.
For sure. All right, well, until next week, y'all, we will see you next Wednesday. Take care of yourselves, drink lots of water, and be safe.
You too.
Keep well.
Bye, guys.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.